Thank you, everyone. Let's see, let me just move my screen, John. As mentioned, I'm Dan Biggs with Weston Sampson. I'm a landscape architect, as well as the regional manager of our New York offices. A little bit about Weston Sampson. I think many of you may be familiar with us, more from our engineering wing, but we're a full service consulting firm with offices here in New York, in Mount Kisco, and Albany. And beyond traditional civil engineering, we do master planning, parks and recreation planning, landscape architecture, ecological environmental services, civil structural engineering, aquatic facility planning design, and permitting. So really, almost all of the work that you see tonight will be handled by Weston Sampson, and then we have support from Barry Dunn, which Tom will give a brief introduction here in a minute on his aspects. Our team is Tom and I, as well as a number of other support staff. We broke up our team into two categories, but really we work as one full team with the master planning and public engagement on one side. And then we'll talk a little bit about a statistically valid survey option for you, which we typically bring in a third-party consultant for that work. And we'll talk about the details of the pros and cons and why you may choose to do that. Really quickly, Tom can give us an overview of Barry Dunn.
Certainly. So Barry Dunn is a large consulting firm. Previously, we were Greenplay and we merged with Barry Dunn. We're located in Portland, Maine, and have offices all around the country. There's over 750 employees. I'm part of what's called the Park, Recreation, and Library Group. It's a practice group that's within the local government practice group. I had over 30 plus years in Parks and Recreation, leading departments at 3 different colleges and universities. I grew up in upstate New York, lived in Syracuse, worked at Marist College and Lemoyne College. I now live in Virginia and had worked at Virginia Commonwealth University. We do feasibility studies, master planning, recreation programming, and so forth. What makes us unique is we're former operators. I've been a consultant for going on 7 years and have done about 85 projects. Many of them have been with Dan and Weston and Sampson.
Thanks, Tom. And our other teammate is RRC Associates. As I mentioned, they're a specialty statistically valid survey firm that all they do is really surveys and market research. And I'll talk a little about this detail here later on when we talk about some of the scope of work we're proposing. But really, when we do projects that may become contentious, or we need to have statistically valid surveys completed because of maybe issues or topics that come up, having a third party firm do this really helps us all, not just us as a consultant sides, but you as the client, so that when you get data back, it comes back before the board or to other representatives of the village, you can stand behind those numbers and know that they're statistically valid, and any questions that come out, you know that they won't be questioned as much because they have that basis foundation mathematically. So really quickly, I want to cover a couple of the projects that we worked on here in the past. Town of Bethlehem was a project we did a number of years ago. And what was interesting on this is that this was their first town master plan. They had been in operation for many years. They had dozens of park spaces that really had been operating pretty well, but they really wanted to see what could they do better and how could they operate their facilities in a better manner. Just upstream from you in Beacon, we've been working in Beacon now for 7 or 8 years on multiple parks and trail projects. And just within the last couple of months, they decided to embark upon a new Parks and Rec master plan to really start getting an idea on how people are using parks. And now in the post-COVID life, they're seeing more interests, varying interests. So trying to regroup as to how can they better serve the community with their current park facilities, and what do they need to improve to enhance their park spaces. Just over the border in Canton and Darien, We worked on a number of projects for them, each of the 2 towns, looking at their park and open spaces, and really come together as to what do they need to improve as they see their population changing. In Darien specifically, they see a change of their demographics from a younger population demanding new and improved athletic and park spaces. As where in Canton, they really were just trying to hang on and identify where should they invest in the next park or the parks that they have, because they didn't really have any additional need for spaces, but just how do they reinvent themselves as a small town. A couple of projects that we worked on together with Green Play, Barry Dunn, and Weston Sampson up in Saratoga Springs. That's a little bit of a larger city, but closer to you down Lynbrook maybe would be more relative, where we worked on the village to look at their kind of their prime park space within the village to identify what needs they have and how could they accommodate the different probably dramatic different user groups demanding the same space at the same time, and how would we balance those. Others in Groton and Colchester, Tom worked on a number of projects over the years, but each of these projects bring forward similar ideas, similar topics. We see kind of the trends are happening over the years, but we'll bring those forward to your project, which I really want to talk most about tonight. So a couple of the large objectives that we are really focused on bringing to the table to help you with your Parks and Rec master plan. The first is really to develop a vision. We really want to have an idea and talk with you all as to how do we create and prepare for the future while retaining how you may have used the park spaces in the past, and what aspects really we want to retain as you maybe reinvent some park spaces or simply just stabilize them for current uses. With all of our master plans, really we want to have this as a working document for staff to use, or even as the board to use, with implementable goals and priorities. We really see this working document as a document can be used to focus your efforts and really have goals that you can see that will be implemented over the upcoming years. These are achievable priorities, which we'll talk about here in a minute, a couple of our tasks, as well as just simply a strategy that you'll be able to use as a foundation for how to operate and maintain your park spaces. And finally, it's really critical that all of our plans are financially sustainable, not only from a financial side for current maintenance and operations, but for as new facilities come on board, how can the village really maintain these facilities for years to come and still have the same quality of facilities after the day after they are implemented. So a couple of key components, I won't go through all these, but our approach is that we're gathering a lot of information from multiple sources, whether it's from staff and outside agencies, to local historical knowledge, to trends and regionally and nationally that happen in the parks recreation realm, to the public process, which we'll talk about some public engagement sessions we propose, as well as just simply what we see on the ground from the day that we walk on and look at your current facilities and how they're being maintained and operated. And it's really the balance of all these, not only from the physical improvement standpoint, but also the environmental standpoint and how we can balance these needs and wants for your residents to use for years to come. So our first phase, our first step in the project will be to really have a kickoff meeting with staff and key stakeholders. Really, this is a point where we try to get on the ground and have that first discussion about the plan, about how we've proposed, how we need to possibly modify our approach, and really work with staff to have a path forward. In this meeting, we'd have a time to talk about critical success factors, really what are the hot topics that are happening or in the village, and possibly constraints, either schedule-wise or just simply a user standpoint-wise. And then really we would set up a project committee would be our proposal, to have a number of either staff and select stakeholders to be that ongoing engaged party on a monthly basis to interact throughout the project. This really helps us keep on our goals and objectives as we move forward through each of the steps of the project. So after the kickoff meeting, really we would get on the ground and start looking at your current facilities. This looks at an assessment of each of your village parks and recreation spaces, as well as any of your open space properties you may have currently within the village. Through this process, we'll be looking at what is the current kind of role of each of these park spaces. Are the neighborhood parks? Are they the main highlighted park for all the uses? And really, what is the current status in terms of quality of equipment or park lands or fields within each of these spaces? At the same time, we'll look at all alternative service providers within the area. And some really wonder why we do this, but I go back to saying, if you have a soccer team, you might have a recreation soccer club for youth up to the age of, say, 10. And then you may have a more travel league soccer team. Well, they may not have the same demands of your park spaces, but they may be using other, say, the school property or other athletic facilities locally that we don't want to necessarily overlap. So when we hear of the demands within the village for additional soccer fields, we want to know what other facilities could be used or are being used by your residents and teams within the community. So look at those other providers to really get a handle on what else is out there and how they're being used within your community. So this culminates in the existing conditions analyses, looking at your recreation, park, and open spaces. And really this would be one of the first chapters within your final master plan. The next step, we start looking at the community, and Tom, you can handle a little bit of this needs assessment.
Certainly. So one of the things we do a demographic study and a trend study to make sure that we have a good handle on the demographics of the village now and for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We match that with a trend study where we're looking at trends nationally, regionally, and then specifically locally, what trends have occurred in the village. And a lot of times we can identify something, a program or something that may be coming to your community in advance of you actually knowing it's coming, and it helps you be prepared either from a facility standpoint or from a programming or staffing standpoint. You know, with the survey that Dan is potentially talking about and other methods, we'll be trying to find out what different groups in the village, you know, what are they looking for in the way of the park and recreation system, and what are things you can do to attract more visitors. You know, will help determine, as Dan said, whether you need more parks and facilities, and if so, what type. And we will be looking at what recreation programming you do, what the people say they need, and again, what is available in the community from alternative service providers as well. And in the end, we'll identify any major unmet needs, and we'll be making recommendations for how the village can address those. We'll also, you know, Dan will look at your inventory, and we'll work with him to do an analysis of what services and programs can be handled or maintained by your existing facilities, and we'll be looking at your staffing as well.
So with these two needs assessments, it really leads us into the public outreach process. Even before COVID, we had the idea of using mixed method approach. And this is really the balance between traditional methods with our stakeholder interviews, focus group meetings, online surveys, and public meetings, balanced with the virtual options, which all of us are attuned to these days, as even in this meeting, where we have virtual meetings, online polling, virtual fly-throughs or recordings, and then social media. So our approach is to not have just one single technique or tack to get input from the public, but really balancing this so that we can attract users of all ages and interests to have input into this master planning process. So the mixed method approach that we propose and have been successful over several projects now starts off usually with a number of stakeholder interviews and focus group meetings. These can be in person or mixed with virtual open door meetings as Zoom meetings like this. And really they're a group meeting of say 15 to 20 people max in an hour block timeline in one day, where we'd have users or stakeholders come to the table or come to a meeting and really share with us as to their thoughts about the parks and recreation system. And that's really the first pass at hearing from people and understanding what the hot topics or interests are within the village. We will then supplement that with an online community survey. This can basically be a Survey Monkey of sorts survey. Could also be printed out as in paper version for users in the community that may not have access to computers or may not be as computer savvy as different generations. And that really would lead us into what we call a statistically valid survey or not. And I'll talk about that here in the next slide as I run through the next couple of our meetings. So after the survey is ongoing, we would have a public meeting, the first public meeting. And this is really where we are gathering more input in a larger group setting. So the entire community invited. This could be virtual or in person. And really we start hearing about interests and ideas within the community. The second public meeting, we go back out to the public and we share what we've been hearing through the whole public engagement process. So part of the process is not only to listen, but also to inform the community to know that we're listening to them and we hear what their needs and interests are. We wrap up the master planning process by presenting a draft recommendations presentation to usually the board, but then we will go back out to public for adoption of the master plan for whatever processes that has to happen. So back to the online survey, we typically would do a statistically valid survey. And what this is a mailed or web survey. It reaches users and non-users, basically anyone within the village. We can geocode it and have it customized to the interests of the village. And really this allows us to have a third-party survey that gets questions that we work with them to pull together, but they have statistics behind them to support with confidence that the results here, that anyone here on the board may get questioned later on, you have the confidence that the data that comes in is statistically valid and can be shared and supported throughout the project and beyond. Some communities choose not to do this, but where we do see that there's maybe contentious issues or topics that are debated heavily, this has been beneficial to sometimes squash some misnomers within projects or simply just inform the residents as to what truly we're hearing statistically that the community really wants or needs for the project moving forward. So for this project, we've proposed two options. One is a full statistically valid survey. This is where we have paper copies, we have online surveys, and we tabulate all the results within the project. The second option is simply where as a postcard option. We still do our tabulations and results, but the mailing is simply a postcard that someone can go to a link online, either a QR code or simply a web link to get to use the survey. So still can be mailed out to the entire population within the village, and we would hope to get back 10% of responses to make it statistically valid. So with all the input we will be receiving and the on-the-ground analyses we'll be doing, that really creates a couple of the first 2 or 3 chapters. And then you see in bullet number 3, we start looking at assessing of your facilities, really coming up with recommendations from a staffing level or physical improvements or programming level needs for the village. This is really where we're taking all of we've heard, circling back to what the regional and national trends are looking like, what we're hearing as the need is within the community, and come up with recommendations on how you can improve your village park and recreation system for years to come. So I want to thank you all for input. I can open up to questions now, but really this is what Tom and I and our teams have been doing for, I was thinking about this evening, maybe a dozen projects together of park recreation systems of all sizes. We want to be a partner with you in terms of working on this together. And really, this is what we love to do. So we are excited about the opportunity, and we can open to any questions you may have at this time.
Daniel, thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive presentation, and I think we really appreciate it. I have a quick question. Well, I have a couple of questions. What is the anticipated timeline from the beginning to the end, assuming we do a survey?
Sure. And I thought you might ask this because it's a common question. Typically, a project like this runs between 6 and 9 months. Generally, and a lot tends to hinge upon the start date and when we can actually get out to the public to see and meet the residents. So depending on when you start, a critical kind of 2 capstones are when school ends, because we really want to get students, population involved in the input, as well as when do families return from summer vacations, you know, the end of the summer time periods of September. So starting in between those bookends, it can happen and it's fine. We just make sure that we have a chance to reach out to residents of all ages and interests. So 9 months is pretty safe bet to plan on.
Okay, well, you did also just answer my second question, which was about whether the survey or the outreach would be to students as well. So I'm assuming that in your answer, you suggested that to be true.
Yes, that's correct.
And that is that like what age groups do you do? Middle school? I mean, high school? I mean, how do we get to them?
Sure. So we encourage users of all ages to be engaged. We have done the first stakeholder input sessions sometimes with simply just youth students, and I would say kindergartners through middle schoolers as one whole group, or high schoolers as a whole group. So we can work with you on what groups exist within the village and how we may have access to them. We've also sent flyers or surveys to teachers within the school districts, and then they facilitate an in-house charrette or survey activity that they can use that and send back to us for the results, and we'll incorporate that into our data. So we encourage users of all ages, and reach out to parents through either existing clubs or teams is always a great way to get the students involved as well.
Mm-hmm. And then you talked about a project committee that would meet monthly, that would include staff and stakeholders. So how large of a project committee do you anticipate? And would that be for the entire duration of the 9 months?
Yeah, so the project committee basically is a group, possibly 6 to 8 people, a mix of staff or trustees, possibly 1 or 2 trustees, in maybe 1 or 2 of the more engaged stakeholders within the community. And we can certainly work with you on, if you have a list of interested parties, how we can work that into the system. By no means does it mean that they have the greatest voice in the process, but they're just there to assist us in kind of keep the project moving. Sometimes staff gets bogged down in the summer with activities, and other stakeholders can kind of help out and keep things moving with us as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have 2 major parks within the village, but we have lots of smaller areas and pocket parks and other places that are not even called parks. Would this include a review of all of those open spaces?
Yes, so all the kind of formalized park spaces for sure. The open spaces, which may be undeveloped at this time, it may be a light review, so you may not have anything there for us to look at besides environmental features. So we can definitely work with you on looking at all the spaces that the town or village owns to assess as to potential and opportunities or possibly preservation needs within the village.
Do you also look at things like one of our parks might have a flooding issue or has environmental impact issues? And is that all considered in your review?
Yeah, so as we actually wrote some of that in our proposal, we will be looking at the environmental features within the parks or open spaces, really to look at either wetlands, streams, floodplains, forested areas. So we'll have that lens as we're looking at it for sure as to how these environmental areas either can be preserved, protected, or restored if necessary.
Okay, I just have a couple of more questions. You used the words contentious issues, I think twice.
Yes.
So I was just curious, what issues have you come up that are considered contentious issues?
So every community is different, but I can speak to others in the area. One of which was there was a high demand in a community for a pool facility. And this town did not have a pool at all, and they have a land for it, but no one wanted it. And I would say some loud voices said they didn't want it, but the survey showed that was one of the highest need features within the community. So because they had not had it for many years, the existence of the entire town, it was perceived as though it was not a need and there's no wants. Well, the survey proved that that was completely inaccurate. Only loud voices were being heard for many years. That's just one example. And then it came down to what's the right place to construct and build a pool? Is it a seasonal pool? Is it enclosed? Is it for competitions? Is it with a splash pad? So every feature you could imagine goes into the idea of a pool, and everyone has different visions of a pool facility. Trickled out through the whole process to then talk about staffing, programming, needs. It snowballed to some degree. They landed on a park space that then became contentious that that park space should not have a pool. But that's just one example where dog parks turn out to being one of those features sometimes. So I'm sure you have your own in your community that we will hear pretty often, frequent from the get-go, I'm sure.
Okay, and what are some of the trends you see happening today in parks?
I'll start off and then I'll let Tom jump in. But pickleball has been a pretty hot court sport. We've heard over many years. Now I would say it's in every community more or less due to the low cost to implement a pickleball court feature within a village or town. Dog parks, we're hearing more need for off-leash run areas to account for the four-legged friends. But Tom, I don't know if you have any that come to mind offhand.
Certainly. Connectivity is really a big thing now. People want to be able to walk to their park if possible, or if they're at a park, to have a trail that goes around the park and goes from the parking lot around the park and back to that trail. We find that can help increase use of the park by as much as 70%. I think during COVID, a lot of people started using their parks as their outdoors in their backyard. So there's more and more people looking to go outside. Walking for exercise is a really big thing. Those are some of the trends. And as Dan said, pickleball is very big, but we would dig into what's going on in the village specifically to learn more about that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to open this up to the board members to see if anybody else has any questions. If you want, you can take down your presentation unless somebody has a specific question about it.
Sure.
They want to keep it up. That's fine.
Madam Mayor, I do.
Okay.
My question is for Tom, and looking at the presentation on page 14, talking about the needs assessment. All right. What are the demographic trends for the village? Tom, I was wondering if you were talking about, population trends, whether or not our population is moving towards more seniors or more young families are moving in. Is that all taken into consideration when you're talking about planning a park, the actual demographics of the village itself?
Yes, we do a very detailed demographic study. One of the things we would do during the strategic kickoff is ask you if you already have a specific source that you do use for your different, when the village reports demographics. We typically use Esri Business Analyst as one of our sources and information from the US Census. But we would be looking at giving you information, what we believe your population is today and what it's going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15, 20, the age of your population in each of those, so is the population going to, become older or younger? What is your median age of your population? We look at household income. We study that. We look at whether the majority of your village is going to be, living in single family or multi-family. Are they looking to own or rent? We look at what type of education they might have. Your family units, is a typical family in the village 2 people and 2 children, or is it, 2 people and 2 dogs, or, what is it? We look at all of that. What else do we look at? We look at what type of activities people are typically doing and want to do as part of the demographics, and then again as a trend. So it's a very detailed study. We have a couple people in our firm that's what they do for us. So
one of the issues that I'm sorry, Andy, did I interrupt you?
Yes.
No, I was gonna follow up on that.
Oh, I was just gonna go ahead, Steve. I was gonna talk
finish
about the
mine.
school district versus the village. So if you want to.
Well, I just want to, as the mayor referenced, we just finished our comprehensive plan, which, did a lot of looking at the demographics of our community and future trends. So would this be redundant to that, or would you build off of that, or how would you sort of expedite that process?
Yeah, one of the things we typically do right at the strategic kickoff is we'll ask for a lot of background documents. We'll ask for any of your existing plans, your comprehensive, village plan. If you have an ADA plan, if you already have a, trails or connectivity plan, we'll ask if you've done a recent Parks and Recreation master plan 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We'll ask what surveys you may have recently done, all of that. And we will ask you for your own demographic studies if you have them. And then, if you don't have one, we'll do the whole thing. If you have one, we'll look at it and update it to learn as much as we can. But, anything you have, we read and look at. And then, if we think there's different information, we'll develop that and share that with Dan and then with the project team. I think, Andy, did you have another question?
No.
But I think earlier your question was about, will we identify seniors? Yeah, well, we look at the different generations. There's seniors, there's millennials, there's Generation Z, and we identify all of those and how many people are in each one of those groups.
Oh, no, that's going back to my original question, and I do thank you for answering that. Because there is, how would I say it? Even though I consider our park very big, it's also limited space for what is trending now. Whether or not we need a cricket field and a softball field and a, men's softball field, or, a soccer field, is it, I really want to know those answers, what the people are saying. So whether or not a bocce court wants to be put in or something, that's why I was asking about if you're going to run the spectrum of asking demographically from seniors down to young families.
Yes, and as Dan said, we'll be kind of looking at everything, and it's not always just the loudest voice. Like, sometimes we'll go in a community and none of the little leaguers or soccer people will come out, but the pickleballers will come out. But we find out there's 80 pickleballers and there's 2,000 little league baseball players. We'll find that out, and then we kind of weigh what we're recommending. So it's just not the person who screams the loudest. It's really a deep dive.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a few questions. So I was just wondering if you have experience developing inclusive parks and playgrounds for families with different needs, sensory needs, kids that are differently abled, as well as for families with kids across various age ranges.
Yeah, so in addition to our planning process, we typically like to take projects through design, and that includes inclusive playgrounds. So whether it's from a sensory or a tactile needs, or simply the setting of the playground has so much to do with how students or just patrons react to the environment around them. So a lot of our park projects have included playgrounds of many sorts, whether it's from a natural play standpoint, where we're using rocks and boulders and logs and less plastic and metal, but others we're using a zoning idea for having spaces that may be for the active play versus more need for isolation, quieter spaces, less active play, more passive within our play spaces. So yes, every plan we dream that we can take you through to construction, that we can help you through that process. Our team is made up of landscape architects, engineers, and scientists. So we plan to take as far as we can with you to make the best accommodations and facilities for the village.
And our public engagement that we do together as a team, like in our focus groups and our stakeholder meetings, we always ask the question, who, what, where is underserved in a community? So we're trying to find out what group, and whether it's east side or north side, or seniors or whatever. And when we set up the focus groups, we'll make sure that they're very diverse, and we don't really just want to meet with 15 soccer parents in a meeting. We like to meet with a diverse group, and we have many of those meetings. So it's a big focus for our firm, and I know it's a big focus for Dan's firm.
Yep. Yeah, that'll be important in our village because our district does have a very robust special needs program. And so we want to make sure that those families feel welcome and that they have safe spaces for their children. Another question I had was just, climate resiliency. For example, we're having a rain event tonight. Every time we have a rain event, one of our existing parks is underwater. How do we build parks that is, I know we can't be 100% resilient, but somewhat resilient to these extreme weather events. We're going to have extremely hot summers. We're going to have some really wet days. And so how do we try to build some infrastructure such that we can mitigate runoff? We can make sure there is runoff. There's more impermeable surfaces around the equipment so that we don't have full periods where it's inaccessible for our community.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback just on that piece too? Also, just some thoughts on natural grass versus turf and where that might play into for some of these facilities too. Is that come into play?
Yeah. So, Asha, to answer a little bit of your question, some of the factors we can't control, right? So the village has only so many spaces that we can work with. So within the confines of what you currently maintain, operate, own, yes, it's finding the right solutions for use of that land as a first pass, where should you plan a soccer field in the floodplain, right? So you could raise it, but is that the best thing for the riverine condition that's adjacent to that parkland? Maybe not. Maybe it should actually be floodable space and should not be anticipated used after a severe rain event, because that's flood storage for the community, not necessarily the soccer field that they hope to have a game tonight. So it's first looking at the setting of the site. The second is looking at if that is the deemed use, say a soccer field, what measures can we implement now or add to it to handle those runoff, to when we do have a severe storm event, allow infiltration, allow storage of volume also for water quality within that space as well, adjacent to the soccer or the park space. So it's working in those kind of design techniques into our planning process that we're thinking about what is the best use and the right use for the lands.
Right.
The synthetic versus natural turf, that is sometimes one of those key items that I mentioned that do come up in many communities as to either concerns from one side or the other, whether you have it the increased need or desire for pesticides and fertilizers from a health standpoint versus the health standpoint of the potential carcinogens from synthetic turf fields. And there's a balance. So in our process of first looking at the demand and need for rectangular or diamond fields, we would see, do you have the ability to meet those needs? If you don't, is another alternative surface the best approach? And if so, where is the best place to locate that if that's desired of the village? So in that process, we start definitely evaluating the right facility in the right location and for the need. So, thinking about synthetic turf fields, one thing that they do is they do have a decent storage capacity for stormwater that many don't even see. They just see the grass green all the time, but there is capacity below grade. So we would evaluate those as that need or the wants within the village come to the surface and evaluate what is the right place and facility type for the village needs and wants.
One other question I had, I actually have two more questions. One was, you mentioned connectivity. So when you're looking at the parks, are you looking at what's in the vicinity and then possibly providing recommendations on how we improve access? Because I think you mentioned where there was connectivity and clear access, you saw improvement in the use of the parks and related trails. So is that something you look at? You kind of at a high level see what we're missing, where the gaps are, and how we can fill that to make sure that the parks are more walkable and more accessible in our community?
Yeah, and it kind of takes upon two kind of perspectives. One is interconnectivity within the park space itself that Tom was alluding to, where circular pathways were just places to walk enjoyable within the park itself. But the second is connections beyond the park to your neighborhoods, to your commercial core, so that people not only can say go to the park to enjoy a walk or enjoy a soccer game, but possibly walk to get ice cream down the street and not have to get in a car and drive there 2 blocks away. So a lot of our high level analysis look at what are the current barriers to allowing better walking and biking within your community to resources nearby and close. It may be a stream, simply people don't have access across the stream for whatever reason to the backside of a neighborhood. Instead, they have to drive around and then park in the parking lot of the park space. So we'll be looking at those in that kind of assessment level of how your park, where your park setting is relative to the adjacent uses, and then interconnections within the park itself of how do we encourage people to not have to drive everywhere or simply drive across the parking lot to get to the playground versus walking on a safe pathway to get by the soccer field to get to the playground.
Right. Yeah, that'll be helpful. My last question was just outreach with our seniors. They're not necessarily using technology. How do we go to where they are? And just communication for it to be inclusive. I think how we do communication has to be creative and thoughtful. And so I just want to make sure, what we saw in our census, we saw growing young families, but we also saw that there was, a growing number of older people in our community. And I just want to make sure that we're being thoughtful in how we're reaching them in ways that's constructive to them.
Yeah, and you just kind of mention one thing is that usually we're going to them for seniors. You know, there's some part of the population that are able and interested to get out to the recreation spaces for meetings. A lot of times we're going to the centers where they are. You don't like to take too much time, but sometimes jumping before an event that they have, so you can get us that they're there already. We just tag on with their coordinators to engage with them before their bingo or a dance or their hours that events that they're pre-scheduled. So it's working with your community stakeholders that are in touch with those user groups and can really tip us off to saying, we can get you in, and here's a time, it's 2:30 on a Wednesday. That's a time you got 10 minutes. Get in and get their attention, because they're gonna go down the hall to their pre-planned event.
Right.
Yep.
Yep, that was it for me.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. So the end product, I mean, obviously, you know, the likely result is going to be something that we're going to have to implement over a number of years, finance over a number of years. Will it give us recommendations about how to chunk up the work, and so that we can do it, you know, over the course of our capital plan?
Yeah, so the key points to our recommendations, everything has a goal and objective. Within those objectives, everyone has a cost, either a capital cost or a maintenance cost that the village would have to incur over a period of time. And then the time it would take to do the activity with when it should be implemented, either high priority, near future, low priority, further out. So like maybe 10, 15 years would be the long-term vision. So obviously depends on what the village would take upon for a capital project or capital improvement plan per year. But the more we know from you as to what is palatable, I would say, by the village, helps us draft that so we can give you an annual budget that you could shoot for to get this plan implemented in the next several years. There's some communities that we work in where they simply say, tell us how much we should do and what you think is the highest priority, medium and lowest priorities. And then we will take that and bite off what we want to do first within our capital plan. So it kind of works two ways, but we will work with you certainly to get something that you can have and go before the board of trustees to get voted upon and agreed upon to implement.
Great. Anybody else have any questions? Dan and
I
Tom,
also presume there's going to be a study that will maximize the hours of usage, obviously based upon, you know, we're no longer going to have daylight savings, let's just say, but obviously here in New York, we fluctuate as far as how long our parks can be used. So is there a lighting plan? Is there things that come along with this that light up the trails, the connectivity, so that this can be used for the maximum amount of hours varying on the year?
Yeah, so in our existing conditions analyses of your facilities, one thing we'll be looking at is lighting available at any of your fields? And I don't know offhand if you have that or even your trails possibly. So with lighting, we obviously are able to extend the period of use for any of your facilities. We would take that into account as to if you have demand for, say, 2,000 playing hours, you know, if you can only meet with 1,200 for whatever reason because of daylight is an issue, recommendation may be that you need to get lights on a field or a trail connection to get access to a park. But all this could, you know, lead to the demand for more fields within alludes to many cases the surface material options that allow you for more playing time for maximum use for in the shoulder hours of the day. But
I've done an awful lot of synthetic turf versus natural grass, or natural grass versus synthetic turf studies, and you know, and also very well versed on the number of hours that a field can really withstand. I grew up in upstate New York, Syracuse, and then lived in Poughkeepsie and Red Hook before I came to Virginia.
Great, great. Thank you very much.